Hey guys, Mr. Halpin here. Today what I want to do is I just want to create a brief video explaining chunk number 3 of your study guide. Now as a reminder, these videos are not meant to be the only resource you use when you're studying for your test. Instead, they should just be an additional resource you use when you're studying. Let's get started. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the Qin Emperor. Now I know this looks like it's pronounced Quinn, it's pronounced Qin. Now during the period of the Warring States, as a reminder, ultimately the states, they rebelled against one another and they rebelled against the king. It was an absolutely brutal time. But the last one left standing was the Qin, who controlled China from the Huanghe to the Changjiang. Ultimately, how did they change China? Well, several different ways. First of all, China became a brutal place. Really, really brutal and had really strict rules. The reason for this is they implemented the philosophy of legalism, which is something we've talked about a great deal in previous videos. Now, in addition to this, he also created the government position known as a censor. What the censor would do, it was an official who watched others for correct behavior. Specifically, they were likely to watch government workers, and if those government workers weren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, they would be severely punished. In addition to that, he also created a currency, which is a type of money that everybody in China had to use, and he hired scholars, which are really, really intelligent people, to simplify the Chinese writing system. But the most famous thing that he did was he ultimately built a great wall to protect China from outside invaders. Now, the one that was really problematic for the Chinese and the one that really scared them was the Zainu. Previous emperors had begun building walls in northern China to protect them from this group of nomads, the Zainu. Ultimately, though, Qin, who was the emperor of the Qin dynasty, he unified these walls and he strengthened them. Today, this is one of the most remarkable structures the world has ever seen. And again, it's known as the Great Wall of China. Now, once Qin, the emperor, died, the Qin dynasty soon died out with him. The reason for this is people were really, really tired of the harsh rule, and they wanted a change. So the next dynasty that takes over is the Han Dynasty, which lasted for almost 400 years. Now, really, the first strong emperor of the Han Dynasty was known as Han Wudi. And Han Wudi, he saw some problems in the tradition of how people were chosen for government positions. More specifically, previous emperors just chose family members or they chose loyal aristocrats to positions of power. Hammudi didn't like this. Instead, he wanted the most qualified and smartest people to be in charge of those positions. So he ultimately created civil service exams, which every male had to take. The ones who did the best on it were given the positions of power. Now, I know what you're wondering. Did this actually allow and benefit everyone in China? The answer is no. The reason for this is the ones who could really afford to send their children to schools to prepare for these exams were the rich. So they were by far the most likely to actually do well on the tests and most likely to get the government positions. And that brings us to our next section right here on education. So as I previously said, schools were created by the government where boys, if they wanted to go there, could study about law, history, and the idea of Confucianism. After many years of schooling, they would then take the examination. If they did well, they would become government workers or teachers. And also, if they did well, they got a great deal of respect in society. That brings us on to our last page of our study guide, which next talks about the population boom. So at this time, the population in China, it just expanded greatly or immensely and went up to 60 million people. Now, this was really problematic at the time because farmers had to produce more food with the growing population. However, they had a really difficult time doing so. Now, the reason for this, and it's something we've already talked about a little bit, is when farmers would die, ultimately all of their land would go to their sons, all of their sons, and their grandsons too, all of the male heirs, and it would be divided up equally. Thus, property became smaller and smaller and smaller as the generations went on. Ultimately, by the middle of the Han Dynasty, Farmers only owned about 1 acre of land that they could use for their own food, and they could not raise enough food to support their families. So they had no choice. They had to sell their land to the rich, and they worked as tenant farmers, which is just people who worked land owned by somebody else. Thus, this created a real divide between the rich and the poor. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. Now, there were some really, really famous Chinese inventions at this time, and I want to talk about just a few right now. The first that we see is the iron plow, which ultimately could break up soil much more easily than the wooden plow could, and thus crops were able to grow at a much higher rate and faster rate. The next invention we see is the rudder. Now, what the rudder would do is it actually allowed ships to sail against the wind for the first time in human history. Thus, they could go a lot further than other ships could at this time. In addition to this, there was also advancements in the medical field. One such advancement was acupuncture, which is basically this idea of sticking needles into your arm and really all over in order to relieve pain. I know that sounds kind of contradictory, sticking needles to relieve pain, but it worked, and it's still used today. The next thing I want to talk about is this section right here. So ultimately, the Emperor Han Wudi, he sent out one of his most famous generals, which you can see right here, to explore areas west of China. The general's mission, or Zhang's mission, was to recruit allies to help China fight against its enemies. While General Zhang was not very successful in finding allies to fight the enemies of China, he was very, very successful in exploring the areas west of China and learning about them. The most famous place he visited was Kazakhstan. There he saw horses of great strength and size, and this really excited the emperor, who wanted some for his own soldiers. He knew if he had great horses, ultimately his army would be far, far more effective in battle. And thus the emperor demanded that they trade silk, spices, and other luxury goods so he could attain them. The trade route to the west would be called the Silk Road in honor of China's most famous export, which I'm sure, as you put it together, is silk. Now, a lot of people think the Silk Road is just one road, and that's not true. The Silk Road is actually a network of trade routes. When the road was completed in the year 100, or in the 100 AD, it was 4,000 miles long, and it stretched from China all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, don't think for a second it wasn't dangerous to travel. It was very dangerous because of the distance, the rough terrain, and of course there was thieves along the road. Now, in addition to actually spreading goods from different regions of the world, it also did another thing. It spread knowledge, culture, and religions. And the most famous religion that was spread along the Silk Road is Buddhism. Now, Buddhism initially wasn't that popular in China. However, when the Han Dynasty falls and collapses, it would become very popular, which we'll talk about momentarily. So why did the Han Dynasty collapse? Well, the first reason is after Han Wudi, the great leader, most of the other leaders after that point were very weak and dishonest. In addition to that, aristocrats, who were the people who owned the land, became very greedy, and they took over more and more land. And as a result, people would rebel. People weren't happy about that. So ultimately, the Han Dynasty, it falls. It collapses. And at this time, people are really anxious, fearful, and feeling unsafe. And as a result, many people turn to Buddhism, especially followers of both Confucianism and Taoists admired the Buddhist ideas, which influenced their own religious rituals and moral ideas. By the year 8400, Buddhism had become one of the most popular religions in China. Hope this video was helpful, guys. We'll talk to you later.